Thanks so much for tuning in to the program. You're listening to a special Pride edition of Show and Tell. I'm going to be speaking shortly with the amazing Pooya Mohseni. Pouya is a trans activist and actress born and raised in Tehran. She came to New York City in her teens and attended the Fashion Institute of Technology. Not only am I really jazzed to speak with Pouya because I think she's an amazing human being, but also because she brings me just a little bit closer to my schoolgirl crush, Mariska Hargitay. And the reason for that is because Pouya played a judge on Law and Order Special Victims Unit. So here's my conversation with Pooya Mohseni. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so as you know, the premise of this show is that we speak to people in diaspora communities and ask them about an object that most makes them feel at home or something that they carry with them. And so you sent me a photo of your object. Could you show it now? Let me see it in real life here. Masalan. Okay, so I'm going to guess that this is an oil lamp of some kind.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and what's the backstory? Why have you been carrying this around with you?
Okay. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, gave this to me as I was as a child. I mean, like, I never actually had a twine in it. I've never actually used it. And as I'm looking at it, it even has my baby teeth in it. This is how old this is for me. It's like you're Iranian, and it's like this idea of going and buying things for family members, especially the younger members. It's a more modern concept. It's kind of like, the consumer society. Whereas the older generations, it was things that were handed down from generation to generation. And so this you probably can't see, but even some of the original paint is kind of like peeling off. You can see that
I
it's
see
not
it. I see it a
completely
little bit there.
consistent.
Yeah.
So this is how old this is. This is, I would say, at least 50 years old, probably closer to like 90 to 100 years old. And my grandfather had given this to me. I think I was about 5, maybe 6, maybe 7. And I've carried this from Iran to Dubai, back to Iran, then to England, then to New York, and the multiple places that I've lived. Whenever I look at this, it connects me to a couple of things. First of all, who gave it to me? My maternal grandfather. That was the only grandfather I knew. And basically my grandparents, they kind of raised me because both my parents worked. So my childhood memories are all with them. Their stories, the love that they showered me with, the food culture, the Iranian food culture. And the first 9-10 years of my life, that was during the Iran-Iraq War. It just connects me to that. And there's a certain warmth that every time I look at it, I can hear their voice in my head. And
What were their names?
my grandfather was named Yadullah, which in translation means hand of God.
Yes.
I mean, a little bit pretentious of a name, but that's a whole different story. Yadullah Haydari. And my grandmother was Sadiqe Kashmirian, which Kashmirian, to those people that don't know, the root of Iranian names, like Kashmirian, basically means somebody who's from Kashmir. So my great-grandfather on my grandmother's side had come from Kashmir. And these two people, they were everything to me. I get a little emotional because next week is the 29-year anniversary of my grandfather passing.
Oh, wow. Ruheshun shad.
Yes. I was 16. My grandfather was a retired army general from the Shah's army. He was like a career army guy. He joined the military school when he was 18, and my grandmother was somewhat of an archetypal, army wife, 5 kids, that kind of thing. But the older I get, the more I realize so much of who I am, its foundation comes from all the days that I spent with them. I heard their stories. I heard their conversations with each other. I think the first cigarette I sneaked was my grandfather's cigarette when I was like 7 or 8, because, everybody smoked in that generation.
It was good for you at that time, they used to say.
Sure. Yeah, that's what it was. But I think like the best part of myself, my Iranian side, I think the root of it is my relationship with these two people.
When was the last time you saw them?
29 years ago, Sizde Bedar, the 13th day of the year, was the last day I saw my grandfather alive. And then he died on the 14th. And I still remember that day. It was a family gathering, That's what Iranian families do. They get together with family members to kind of like get rid of the
bad omens.
The bad omen of the 13th day and all of that. So the last day I saw him alive was the 13th. And my grandmother passed away 8 months later. So this would be 1995.
95. And when did you leave Iran?
My mom left early 96. I left December of 96.
December of 96. And then to England.
Yes.
And what was that moment like? Yeah, what was that moment like for you?
Leaving Iran?
You took that lamp with you that your grandfather gave you, but what was that? How old were you at that time when you left?
I was 18.
Oh, you were just finishing your teenage years.
And that last year had been a year that I could write a whole book about, just that year, because I didn't go to school that year. Starting with my grandfather's death, and by that point, my parents had not come to terms, but they knew that I was trans. They had spoken to doctors and they had been told that like I wasn't crazy, it's like, I know it
yes, how it's classified.
It.
Yeah.
And so by the time my grandfather passed away, we were already dealing with the kind of like the postpartum of my parents coming to terms somewhat, or at least acknowledging. So when my grandfather passed away, that was kind of like, for me, I took a nosedive. Mm-hmm. I went into a deep depression. I also had, I was bullied at school and all of that, but I just suddenly felt that the home, the sanctuary had been broken. Because when the patriarch dies, it's like in our families, then kind of like everything falls apart. And my grandfather died. My mom, now looking back, I feel so bad that my mom had to dealing with having a trans child and having to do something about it, losing her father and losing her mother all within a year. And in a society that didn't give her support, or, she didn't really have somewhere that could be her safe place. So now looking back, I just like how she survived that year. I don't know.
I do want...
We didn't...
Sorry to interrupt you, but I do want to get into all of that about what it was like to sort of deal with the trans thing while in Iran. I do want to say also that I met you for the first time. It was last year, right? When we were on a panel together in New York City about queer Iranians, and your mom was in the audience. And I've since spoken to your mom.
I know.
And I have to say, she's a spitfire. And touch wood, I have some here. I
I
am
have some wood too.
I am always in awe of her. Right from that first moment that she asked the question in the audience, and I know that we'll get back to this, sort of dealing with the whole trans thing. But at this point in your life, what sort of impact does your mom have on you
Right
and who
now,
you are as a person? Yeah, right now.
whenever I sit and talk about, who I am and how I've gotten here, I always say I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for who my mom is and was, and maybe even my grandmother. Uh, my mom, I give her credit because, like, the first time that she'd taken me to a doctor was when I was 3. And then when I was 11, and this is, take into consideration, this is before the internet. This is the early 80s, right after the revolution. I'm the second child. My brother is about 8 years older than me. And my mom has this idea. It's like, well, I have 2 children that are male presenting, but one is behaving very differently than the other one. And I also understand that now we're talking a very binary structure, but, again, kind of like rewind 40 something years. And at that time, she's like, well, my child is different and I want to know why. And I want to know what I should do about it, or if I should do anything about it, and take him to a therapist. It's like the therapist kind of like lets me play with girl toys and boy toys. I know that sounds so ridiculous now. And, it's like then telling my mom, this is a phase, just don't pay attention to it and move forward. And my mom's like, okay. And then when I'm 11, another therapist, but that therapist is more interrogating than, asking questions and being, it's like more of a therapist.
What are you thinking at 11?
See,
What
at
is
11, what
yeah.
I remember that in the middle of the session, I started sobbing because he was basically attacking me. He's like, a boy shouldn't do this. And it's like, if you're going out with your mom should feel safe with you. And it's like, I'm like, you're putting this on an 11-year-old. It's like, I'm like, oh my God, talk about. But credit to my mom. She's like, after that, I was discouraged to take you to another therapist because I thought, this is not what I want. This is not what I need. If it's a matter of scolding my child, I can do that myself, but that's not why I'm here. I'm trying to seek guidance. I'm trying to seek help so I can be a better parent. And so my mom didn't take me to another therapist until I was about 16, and I was heavily depressed. So whenever I talk about it, yeah, I mean, like, it wasn't an easy adjustment for my parents and my mom. But the fact that she was trying to be as good of a parent as she could without having the right information, without having familial support, without having community support, without basically having any of the support that now we try to offer parents of queer kids so they can be the best and the most supportive parents. And my mom is kind of like doing all of that blindly. And when I think about it, the turning point of my mom finally being like, we have to do something or we're going to end up with a dead son. And I'd much rather have an alive trans daughter than a dead son. And the story is a little graphic, but basically, to put it in a nutshell, my mom came home and found me in my bed in a pool of blood, having sliced my arm open. And I always say, the core of my advocacy or activism or whatever you want to call it is no parent should ever have to be put in a situation like that. No parent of any child to have to choose between the life of their child and their standing in society and family and all of those things, to come home. As an actor, I have tried to relive that moment, and I'm like, it's literally like if you...
Whoa, it's very good goosebumps.
If literally like the ground under you just caves. And then, it's like she called my dad and she called the emergency, and an ambulance came, and it's like, and then it was after that that my mom is like, we have to do something. We have to get Pouya out. And again, this is like mid-90s. So still this idea of, well, Pouya can't transition within our society, within our community. What would our friends think, and what would that think? So there's still that mindset. But even the bigger thing of, if our child transition here, she's not going to have a life. And but even through all of this, I didn't even know my mom was leaving for England until one day I came home and I saw 2 suitcases at the door. So my parents weren't even talking to me. That's how tense everything was. But she set out, and the original aim was England because my brother was born there. They kind of had more knowledge, but there were no accommodations for queer asylum at the time. And I failed 2 interviews at the British Embassy because they kept saying, how long do you want to go? I'm like, well, I'm going to go transition and it takes time and it's going to be a few years. They're like, we'll give you a 6 months visa. I'm like, well, that's not how
it's not enough time.
It's like they had this idea. It's like, you go, you have surgery, and you go back home. And now you think about it, you're like, you people just have no idea what any of this is about. But then as a last resort, my mom came to the States, and my uncles lived here, and she worked for a small business that one of them had, and she got a worker visa, and I got a dependent visa, and I came here. I would say that my mom's relationship with me, like our relationship, it's been fraught with tension and respect, and it's like, putting 2 queens under one household. There's only one like ultimate queen. And now that I'm older, I can see that my mom was doing things out of love. And it was also fueled by fear, a lot of fear, a lot of like, well, if I didn't let you go there, it's because I was afraid of what would happen. I'm like, yeah, but because of like, how our relationship was, then I moved in with somebody who ended up being a crazy person.
It was about protection, I guess. That's where it all stemmed from. Yeah.
It's like, how closely do you protect something? And it's like, do you protect it this much, or do you kind of like almost squeeze the life out of it? But my mom is the beginning of every story I have when I talk about the support that queer children in general, but specifically queer children, need from their parents, because when you live in a world that is always telling you there's something wrong with you, you shouldn't exist. You shouldn't exist the way that you exist. You should just disappear, and all the things, it's like,
or you're an aberration of
all these things. How important a solid, stable, nurturing, safe home environment, how important that is. And so I always start the story by saying, my mother was put in that situation that she had to come and face her child being a step away from death. And that was the moment that kind of like was this whole revelation for her. Not that up to that moment my mom didn't love me. It's just that she didn't know what to do. And that's too much of a responsibility on a single parent to have to figure all of this stuff out on their own, because we have this idea that our parents are gods and they know everything. And then the older you get, they're like, no, our parents are like human beings that are trying to figure out how things work one day at a time.
I read this article from you that sort of dispelled this idea or myth, if you want to call it that, trans people are confused. Trans kids are confused. They don't know what's going on. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you saw yourself as a child, sort of growing up? How were you centering yourself in Iran?
I lovingly say that I was the most well-adjusted little girl until I realized that I was not perceived that way by others. And, there'd be people like, well, it's like you just wear the clothes and you look down in your pants and this is what you see. And it's like, I'm like, but that's not how we see ourselves. We align ourselves with external expectations. Like, oh, this is what I look like and this is what everybody else wants. And we internalize that external affirmation or discouragement. So for me, when I played house, and again, I look back on it, I'm like, oh my God, what a very binary world I was growing up with. But that's the reality of life. So I can't not acknowledge that. When we played house, I wanted to play the mother. Now, God knows why in that society I wanted to play the mother, but that is like nobody told me to do that. That's what I wanted to do. I would pour tea. I played with Barbie dolls. I never wanted to play with action figures. I never wanted to play, it's like ball and sports. And again, I'm going into this very binary, girls do this and boys do that. And I think it was as I was looking at the world around me, I'm like, these are women, these are men in the most binary, stereotypical sense. This is what they do, that's what they do. And I'm like, oh, I want to do what these people are doing. I never wondered, oh, who am I? What is going on? Who is Pouya? I never had that. No child ever does. We naturally gravitate towards things. The same way we eat something and you're like, oh, I love the taste of that. And you eat something else and you're like, no, I don't like the taste of that. Or you like a certain music. It's like all of these things that nobody tells us, but it's instinctual to who we are. But around 5 or 6 is when I realized that if I showed myself the way that I am to the rest of the world, I would get scolded, or I would get punished, or I would get yelled at. So that didn't change what I did.
Was there a specific incident? Do you remember or recall?
I can't remember something specific, but it would have most possibly come from my dad. Because my dad, a very typical Iranian man, with qirat and, that that perceived manliness of saying like, what are you wearing? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Like, why are you wearing your mother's jewelry? Or, something to that effect. Because I know that my brother knew that I was doing that. So it was okay if I was at home and I was, wearing my mom's makeup or trying on her clothes or her jewelry or whatever when my brother was home, because my brother didn't say anything. But I knew that when, around 6 or 7, that when my parents were coming home, especially my dad, I also got to, in my own way, I thought I was deceiving my mom, but how can you deceive an Iranian mother? She knew. I remember now looking back, I remember she would just say these little sly comments, and I'd be like, I thought I cleaned all of that makeup off. Or I thought that, it's like I didn't have any nail polish left. And she'd be like, what are those little red speckles on your nails? But she never did it in a way to bring my dad's attention to it, because I think my mom knew what was happening and she also knew how my dad would react to it. So I just learned how to be 2 different people.
Wow.
So the confusion that everybody says is the confusion is not internal. The confusion comes from you having something that's happening inside that you are comfortable with and it feels very genuine like every other child. But then you realize that it has consequences. And then depending on who you are, you have different feelings about that battle between the inner you and the outer you. And how are you going to curate this? How are you going to present yourself? And one of the things that I say, the tragedy of so many queer lives, is how much energy we waste in trying to be 2 different people so that we can just move forward and survive. And what a waste of humanity. What a waste of talent. What a waste of energy. What a waste of artistry. But, if anything, I think probably the greatest acting training of my life.
Pouya, do you feel a sense of responsibility? Do you feel a sense of, there aren't many Iranian-American actresses who are trans. Do you feel a sense of responsibility, other trans kids in Iran who may be looking at you, or other trans kids in the US or around the world?
Oh, absolutely. And when I say responsibility, it's I know what it feels like to know that you don't belong anywhere. I know what it feels like to feel that you are the only person. And I don't want any child to ever, Iranian, otherwise, to experience that. Because again, one of the cores of what I say is, now as a 40-something-year-old, I look at it and I'm like, we're all magical. We all have magic that is so unique to us. And if me just being out and open and audaciously brazen in saying, I don't give a crap what you think about me, and maybe a child. There are a few kids that I've spoken to over the past 6-7 years. Some of the stories when I talk to these kids, it's heartbreaking. Like one example, there was this young, 19, 20-year-old person who at the time that I spoke to them, they were somewhere in Iraq, an Irani kid. And they were a chef. And the first few months, and I would sometimes talk to them for like an hour and a half, 2 hours on WhatsApp. The amount of self-hatred, Samira, that was inflicted on this person. So many of our first conversations would be, I look at myself in the mirror and I'm disgusted at what I see. Or I look at myself in the mirror and I ask myself, is this what a man looks like? And so many variations of this. And, they didn't want to socialize with anybody else because they were afraid of getting hurt. They couldn't talk to their family because they could not disclose who they were. And the amount of hate that they had towards themselves, it just broke my heart. Not because I have any personal relationship to this person, but I'm like, a 19-year-old child, and I'm sorry to say, but 19 is a child.
Yeah.
A 19-year-old child who's just at the beginning of life, and they already hate themselves. They already hate themselves so much that the only way they can go to work or they can get through a night without contemplating suicide or without causing self-harm, because I used to do that when I was a teenager, was to take a whole lot of meds. And not that I'm opposed to meds when they're necessary, but this child was carrying the prejudice of a whole society on their back. And as someone who was arrested multiple times when I was a teenager.
In Iran?
Yes. I was almost...
For what?
One time I was wearing a t-shirt, and the accusation was that I was showing arms, and this is pre-transition, so I look like it's like the most adorable teenage boy. And at the time I was wearing like white denim, and at the time my hair was like down to here. My hair is too long, and at one of these times I had a panic attack at the jail, and my dad came and picked me up, and he had to give money and write some sort of an affidavit or whatever. But I was arrested multiple times. I was assaulted once when I was 17. by 3 men while a group of men watched. I was almost run over by a car by a young man, a young religious-looking man who made advances to me, and I declined. And when I got out of the car, he backed the car into me. I tried to commit suicide like 10 plus times. I was bullied at school. I was a good student, but because I did not conform in whatever perceived way, I would be called into not the principal's office, but the, kind of like the head of the morality club at school. So all of those things that I had experienced.
I mean, you had to get the fuck out. You had to get the fuck out of Dodge.
I had already decided that there was no life. Like, I remember when the doctor told my mom that your child, at that time the word was transsexual, not transgender. Your child is transsexual and is suffering from gender identity disorder. Again, at that time it was a disorder, not gender dysphoria. I remember the first thing my mom said. She's like, I heard what the doctor said, but you can't do anything about it until your father and I die. And that's my mother that you see today. That has been such an incredible journey over these 30 years. And I do not blame my mom. I blame society for that, because you've met my mom.
Yes.
My mom is curious and is open to information. But that was the first thing. And at that time, I realized I had no life, that there was not going to be a life for me. And when you don't think that you have a life, that you don't have a place in society, that you don't have a future, what are you going to live for? I basically, within the course of 6-7 months, I tried to commit suicide every other week. Like, as soon as it would heal, the stitches, and they would take the stitches, something would happen. Somebody would say something that would just, throw me down. Now, here I am, about 30 years later, and when I get to talk to a teenager or a tween that tells me they saw me in Terrifier, or they saw my interview somewhere, and that it just made them feel something, I know what that something is. That's something of like, first of all, oh, I'm not the only one. I'm not crazy. Second of all, there's somebody that I can actually reach out to, or maybe ask questions from. And sometimes when they reach out to me, in my humble capacity, I mean, I have no claim that I'm nobody in particular, but I say, if you ever need to talk, I will make myself available. If your parents want to talk, they can either talk to me because, I'm their age and I've kind of been through this world. If not, they can talk to my mother. And in a simple way, remember like when we were on the panel last time, and I have this thing of like, I feel that we're all responsible for the world we live in.
Yes.
And that's my idea of trying to live that out. And there was something that I said that time that you said, I don't give an F if people respect me or not. What I meant by that was not like if you respect my choice or who I am as a person. The basic respect, which is the building block of any society.
Yes.
Respect as in, I may not like you, I may not agree with you, but the respect that we've all agreed to as part of a contract of what a society is, that you walk down the street and you don't kick somebody. You don't, yell profanities at somebody. What I mean is like that basic respect that we need in order to have what we call a society. It's not a matter of agreement or liking. It's like, if we're all going to be in this society, we need to have certain basic agreements upon which we can live side by side. And then, if we want to have a conversation beyond that, when people, they try to be very smart on social media, I'm like, oh, just tell me. I just want to understand. I'm like, no. You don't want to understand. Because if you just wanted to understand, you could Google. And God knows there's no shortage of articles and resources about whatever it is that you want to find. Sometimes even my mom asks me a question. I'm like, Mom, you can Google that.
And Google it, Mom.
Yeah, and it can give you a much better answer than I can give you. So when somebody says, it's like, oh, I just want to understand. I'm like, no. What you're trying to do, you're trying to put me in a position so then you can have a gotcha moment. I was like, see, you're not. So I always say is that we accept many things in this world before we understand it. So I don't know why people have to understand why I am who I am before they accept me. I don't even want you to necessarily accept me or not. I just want you just to acknowledge the basic respect that we all afford each other in a society. That's why we call it a society, a civilized society. And then beyond that, if you have behaved like a respectable part of society, then we can have a conversation beyond that. If people ask me, they're like, how do you feel about always, answering questions and educating people?
Yeah. So are you exhausted? Do you get exhausted by that?
We all get exhausted, but I also look at it in a very pragmatic and realistic way, Samira. Somebody has to do it. And if it's not me, then it's Tucker Carlson. It's Ben Shapiro. At least what I talk about is from my personal experience, and nobody can say, no, you didn't live that. I can say, yes, I did. You can disagree with what I chose, but you cannot disagree with what actually happened, because that is the fact of it. So do I get tired? I don't know, because whenever someone genuinely wants to understand something, and at this point you and I have been faced with enough people of different kinds that who genuinely wants to know something and wants to understand and be an ally, and who just wants to be a pain in the ass. I'm more than happy to be the person who holds a torch and says, oh, the information you're looking for is right there. Here, I'm holding the torch. You can go and find it. I also understand something, especially about the Iranian community, but, larger. People listen with their eyes. And I look like and sound like a respectable, normal, middle-class person, as cringy as all of that sounds. But I understand that when I say something, at the very least, when people look at me, they don't have their guard up, like, what the hell is this person going to say? Because when I sit and talk to them, I joke about it. I still use basically my grandparents' Persian. It's kind of like it's the older Persian in the way that they spoke. Because, language changes, and I've been outside of Iran for almost 30 years. And also my mom is a teacher, so I always have to speak very properly. So when I speak, I also feel that responsibility that I look like polite society. I sound like polite society, only if they knew. And in that sense, I feel I can get into certain rooms where some people would pay attention to me in a way that they would not pay attention to me if I looked and sounded differently.
You're not threatening in that way.
I'm not threatening.
Yes.
And I don't fit their idea, their stereotypes of, it's like, what does a queer person look like? So when somebody tells me, oh, if you didn't tell me that you're trans, I never would have known. I'm like, I know you mean that as a compliment, but it's not a compliment. Because what you're actually telling me is you do not look like the freak that I would have thought you look like based on who you are. And I almost feel like it's a gotcha moment that I'm like, you tell me that I was meant to be who I am because of my cheekbones, or because that I have a long neck, or whatever very arbitrary reasons that people use. And I've had many people say different times, different languages, oh, you just look like you.
Yeah, it makes sense. I could see.
It's like I can see. And I'm like, thank you, but no, because I fit into a stereotype. You kind of feel that I deserve more respect or acknowledgement or a sense of safety. Whereas I would like to take the supposed compliment that you're giving me and bring your attention to the fact that that comes from a particular prejudice of this is what women look like and this is what men look like, and if this happens, then that happens. Bring your attention to that, and maybe make you feel a little guilty about the fact that if I were taller, or if I had wider shoulders, or if I had a lower voice, that you would have treated me differently, so that maybe the next time you come across somebody who does not fit into polite society stereotypes of aesthetics, maybe you would think twice before treating them like an other, like a freak. And I feel that that is a very particular place where I am, because of my background, because of what I look like. So nothing beyond just genes, just like, it's like pure melange of genes and upbringing that I can maybe pinpoint and point out that prejudice. And hopefully, at least it makes people think, even if it not helps them change their mind. Because changing people's minds, you can't change people's minds. You can bring people to the water, but you can't force anybody to drink it. And I'd like to think that maybe that person that says, oh, it just makes sense, that I can say, no, it doesn't, because it's completely arbitrary what you're basing this on. I have no more right to being trans or being respected by you than somebody who would look completely different from me.
I want to come back to this sense of safety that you were talking about. Clearly, in Iran, there was no sense of safety. So what happens to Pouya when Pouya finally arrives in America? Did you feel a sort of weight lifted off? Did you feel like you could right away be yourself?
Unfortunately not. This was in the late 90s. And even though I went to FIT, there was, you think FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology in the middle of New York. I was told I couldn't join the Model Forum, which was an extracurricular club for models. They basically walked the runways for the students who were students, and that's how they kind of beefed up their portfolio. Other designers would see them, want to work with them, kind of like, think of it like a model internship, sort of. The head of the fashion department, who was a lovely woman, I sat in her office. She said, I can't have you join the Model Forum. You'll make the other girls uncomfortable. And I know that you're more elegant and more beautiful than many of the girls in that, but I can't allow this. So that was, it was like...
sort of institutions that you're coming up against now. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, just think, this is the fashion beacon in the middle of New York City. It's not Alabama.
Yeah.
It's in the middle, and it's a fashion school. On the other part of it, I actually was trying to be an actor 25 years ago. I was in the theater group at FIT. I was doing background work on shows that were happening in New York at the time, like Sex and the City, a couple of movies. But one of the other background actors, he outed me on the set of Sex and the City, the series. And the agent that represented me for background work, he dropped me. He dropped me after that incident. Photographers that I was working with to build my portfolio with, at first they're like, oh my God, your cheekbones, you're this and you're this.
And what year is this now?
This would be 99, 2000.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 99, 2000. And when I would tell them that I was trans, then, all communication would cease. One of the parts that I have not forgotten, and this because, I'm in acting, and so this is a very sore spot, was that even when I was in the theater ensemble, which was an extracurricular activity club at FIT, when they would be auditioning other actors who were going to play opposite me in a particular play or comedy skit, they would tell them that the person playing opposite them is a trans person, and do they feel comfortable playing opposite that person?
This is in theater.
And I'm like, you never asked me that. You never asked me if I feel comfortable playing opposite somebody else. So it's these things that I look back, and that's one of the reasons why I left the business for about 7-8 years, because I honestly didn't see a place for myself in this business. Like, just to say it as plainly as I possibly can, nobody wanted me. Nobody wanted to do anything. Nobody wanted to open a door for me. And I guess I look back on it, I'm like, an Iranian trans immigrant, the business could give two shits about what I did. So now that I get to be that was also one of the reasons why I came out 9 years ago in the business. I was like, I have not gone through all the things I've gone through in my life to still be hiding. It's like, what's the point? Why am I doing all of this if I'm still gonna be friggin' hiding? So I made my post in 2015. I think it was June 26th, the day of marriage equality. And I was like, you know what? If not today, then when? It's like, what am I waiting for? In Farsi, we say, "Aba pakiru rikhtam ro dastashun." It was like, I'm like, whatever
Deal
can happen.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful that I got to do that, because first of all, I stopped being afraid that, oh my God, what if people find out the same things that happened like 10 years prior is going to happen again? But more importantly, and that was something I hadn't quite thought of at the time, but in retrospect is happened, it gave accessibility to me for other people who were seeking. Now, whether they happen to be queer Iranian kids in United States, or queer, it's like, I'm Mama Pouya for queer Iranian kids wherever. Like, some of them are on the West Coast, some of them are on the East Coast.
You're like the Statue of Liberty.
But Samira, when they reach out to me, or there were these two trans girls from Iran, that they were filmmakers, and they had seen me in, I think it was Terrifier or something, and they sent me a message and they said, when we saw you, like, they'd seen the movie and they loved the movie, and then horror fans, they go and research, and that they realized that I was Iranian and I was trans, and it's like, to them it was like, oh my God, if she can do it. And I look at it that way, that it's like, if I could have done it through all the crap that I went through, then I want these kids to just dazzle me, and not dazzle me to like show me what you got, but sometimes people feel threatened by younger generations, and what they do is like, well, in my day was this. In my day, what? If they can have a better life, if they can do things in a way that I could have never imagined, if they can accomplish more, I'm gonna boast about it. Like, I actually have a little bit of a share in it, because what do I want to do with it? The misery that we went through, it's not something I'm going to put in a jar and pickle it. That was such an Iranian thing to say, by the way. It's like, so when I see that my experiences, my mom's experiences, and the things that we've gone through these years gives these kids a little boost, a little encouragement, a little sense of community. And I always tell them, to me, you are the light of my life. The greatest accomplishment of my life is being Mama Pouya. And to cheer them on, and to make sure that they know that they matter, that there's nothing wrong with them, and to, just always be encouraging them to find out what is their magic, what are they meant to accomplish in this world, what is their little nook in this big world that they're meant to solve. So for all the people that get intimidated by young people and they keep coming out, in my day, you know what, in my day, I used to think gummy bears were a luxury item. So I don't know if I want to boast too much about my day. But I would like to think that maybe me being out and vocal, maybe it helps some people feel a little more comfortable finding their journey to themselves. Maybe a family. That's what I hope. That's what I work towards.
I am still surprised, though. I mean, when we have these sort of ideas of the theater world, being sort of open to everything and blah, blah, blah. I also was in theater, and I went to the American Musical and Dramatic Academy on the Upper West Side. And I ran away. I ran away after high school and went to this theater conservatory in New York. But I remember, because my mom was like, we can't afford this school, and I just said, oh, just take me to the audition. And I did end up getting a scholarship. But I remember that the artistic director of the school, that's who we had to audition in front of. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Hamlet, the play, but
yes.
So there's that soliloquy in Act 2, Scene 2, oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. And I did that for my audition. And I'll never forget this man, just like towering figure, glasses, and he pulled down his glasses and he said, come here, like, come in front of me. And I walked up trembling to the table and he said to me, don't ever play against your gender. And I was just like, wow. I thought, I'm done. Like, I'm not going to get into this school. And a couple of weeks later, I got the acceptance letter. And I always think back to that moment because I've always played against type. I've always done that throughout my life. And it sort of brought me back to what you were saying about you were always a good actor. You knew how to get around and do these things because, it's just we've dealt with that our entire lives. Depending on who was facing us, we became someone else in order to make them feel comfortable. And that's, I think, what I meant when I asked you, are you exhausted by that? I mean, I'm sure that you don't do that anymore. I know that. You've said that. But at the time, you're 6 and 7. It's such a burden to carry. Does that ever leave you?
No. And, whenever I talk about my life, I never do it with pity. But I look at it and I'm like, life has exhausted me. I think that is the most honest thing that I can say. And sometimes I look at it, I'm like, why do we do this to people? But then you go down to, it's like, what if I was born this way? Or what if I was born to that family? Or what if I was born in that country? And I also know that that doesn't help because I've done that. What if I was just born a cis girl? What if I was born in New York versus Tehran? What if I wasn't born 1 year before the revolution? All of those. But then, and maybe this is how I try to make it work for me in my sense. Greatness has great responsibility. And not that I have any claim that I'm great. But I feel like I've lived a life that very few people have. I have seen cruelty. I have seen generosity. I have survived air raids and assault. And I'm here talking to the great Samira.
Oh my God, please.
No. I mean, to me, that's what it is. You are somebody I greatly respect. And so does my mom.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of respect for you also. But I just think, I just think you're actually a very good actor. And that's sort of, regardless of your work with the trans community and all your activism, I probably haven't told you this, but the first time I saw you was I'm a big Law and Order fan. Because I had a major girl crush on Mariska Hargitay. I still do. And I remember seeing you as a judge on an episode. And I didn't know you. I had no idea who you were. But the moment I saw you, I said, that person is Iranian. Like right away. And I went through the credits. I think I've watched that episode now many times. And I went through the credits and I was like, there it is. Because you don't see a lot of Iranian-American actors, first of all. And it wasn't until I was on that panel with you that I actually made that connection. And I never got to tell you that day in New York City. But I just think you're a fabulous actor. Thank you. I have, because I don't do much acting anymore, I still think it informs all of the work I do anyways. But I want to sort of ask you, what do you like more? Do you like stage or the screen? Because you were just in that Pulitzer Prize winning play English also.
I've been in it 4 times.
That's right. Yeah. So what is it? What is it? Is it stage or screen that you like more?
I'm about to actually be in it a 5th time. Because it's going to Broadway at the end of this year.
And I'm so coming to see that.
And one of the things, this is something I think you would understand. As an Iranian-American trans actor, to make my way to Broadway, you know what that means to me. What I hope that will mean to the younger members of our community, that they can see what's possible. As to what I like good stories. I don't care whether it's stage. I understand the business and how it's different from off-Broadway to Broadway to television to indie film to studio film. That, the amount of worry that you have to go around figuring out who's the audience of this and then trying to make it marketable. Like how big of an audience do you need to make this a successful endeavor? Well, it's different from off-Broadway to television to film. But as one of the older broads that has been around for a little while, I can say that change is happening, and change has been happening over the past 10, 15 years, especially the last 5 years, both queer representation and Iranian representation. I just booked a recurring guest star on a show that I cannot say, but it's like the biggest thing I've booked so far, and it's a lovely character. It's an Iranian character, but like not an Iranian queer character, but just an Iranian woman. And a week or 2 before that, I read another role that was an Iranian character, and it was written by a white person, and it was for a film. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, I can't do this. And I couldn't do this because it was very much written from a white person's point of view and had taken some amount of fact and woven a whole lot of fiction around it. Ooh. So there was this character who is an actual person, but they were presented to be something else. And I'm like, well, if you see this movie, you're going to think that character is this other thing, which is not true. So I was like, I can't do it. It was like some great, white savior story, which like, but having done English, the joy of being, it's like and again, having done it 4 different times at this point with different people and getting to be with different groups of Iranian women.
Can you just tell people a little bit about the play English for those who don't know?
English, it's an Obie-winning, Pulitzer-winning, Lucille Lortel-winning play. It won the Pulitzer in 2023. I've had the great pleasure of having been with it since its first reading in 2018 and its debut at Atlantic Theater in 2022. It's the story of a TOEFL class held in Karaj, and there are 5 characters.
TOEFL is ESL, for those who don't know what that is.
Yeah. Basically, what is it?
It's like an English test.
Teaching of English as a foreign language. That's what it stands for. And there's the teacher and the 5 characters. And each character is trying to learn English for different reasons to basically find their way out of Iran. Now, some person says that they have their green card test like the following month. Somebody else is trying to pass their TOEFL, so they'll be accepted at a university in Australia. Somebody else, who's the character that I had played, well, one of the characters that I played was a grandmother who wanted to go and visit her son and her grandchild in Canada, and they insisted that she speak English because they wanted their child to only speak English in the house. And a younger person who's kind of like, just full of hope. And the play itself is not political, but to us Iranians it's very political, because in a way to be Iranian means that you are political, because inevitably it affects everything that you do. And one of the things we've talked about in the talkbacks, again, I've done it like 120 performances in 2 different roles at 4 different places, is people are like, well, why is this a problem that they're learning this language? Somebody's like, well, I learned French and that's great. And I'm like, yeah, because you chose to learn French because you just wanted to. These characters, they are learning English because in order to have a better life, in order to go and do these things that are integral part of their lives going forward, they have to learn English.
That's not the same. Yeah.
Because, of course, who said that was an American white woman saying, well, I love learning French because I know more. And I'm like, and that's wonderful for you. But you're not acknowledging the privilege that you have, that you live in a country and speak a dominant language that is spoken around the world.
It's crazy that you say that, because when I saw it here in Toronto, I moderated the talkback for English here in Toronto, and we had that exact comment, but it was from a Dutch woman saying that she learned English and what's the big deal, and it goes back to this idea that a lot of us, I think, Iranians are in exile. I mean, I am, but reluctantly, and people don't quite understand that weird liminal state that you operate from. Many of us can't go back to Iran. It's not a choice we've made necessarily.
I said this to somebody. I said, you can say whatever you want about the regime, and by all means, I have twice as much to say, and anybody who's lived in or out of Iran over the past 40-something years. But I, as an out trans person, who's an activist, who's an actor, I would have a hard time going back to my place of birth. I've made peace with it. I come from a place that I was assaulted and abused for so many years, and I got out of it. So it's not that I want to go back. But the fact that it was a place that I basically had to escape, that itself says that there's a part of me that I had to cut off to become the person that I am now. Am I a well-adjusted New Yorker? Absolutely. Did I have to cut a part of me off? Did my mom have to leave her home, her family, her friends, her status, her way of life, to come and find a life for me and for her? Did my brother get smuggled out of Iran at 17? But these are the stories that are not unique.
Mm-hmm.
Millions, if you think about it, Iran is like a business that has the highest degree of turnover. Anybody who either has the financial ability or the educational ability or the familial ability to get out of Iran and go somewhere to have a life, they do.
Yeah.
They have. And imagine if all of these brilliant people, artists, journalists, actors, singers, engineers, doctors, if all of these minds, this brilliance, if all of this did not leave that country, what would Iran be like? And so when people are like, well, somebody can say, well, you chose to leave Iran. I'm like, yeah, my choice was to either I'm going to live or I'm going to die. That's not really a choice.
Yeah.
You cannot be you in Iran. I cannot be me in Iran. And yeah, some regime supporter can be like, well, it's like, we don't want you anyway. I'm like, who the fuck gave you ownership of the country? It's like when people in the United States, they're like, oh, you
don't like it? Get out.
It's like, I'm like, who gave you ownership? This ownership that is like, if you're going to live in Iran, you're going to do this and that and that and the other one. I'm like, who died and left you in charge of the class? And a lot of people can talk about before the revolution, oh, everything was perfection. Well, that was also not the case. And historically, that's, it's a matter of historical record that it was.
Mm-hmm.
But there was more an idea that respect that I was talking about, that societal respect, that I can wear a hijab and you are not wearing a hijab and we can walk side by side.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have to like each other, but we can walk side by side. You go and pray in the mosque and you go to the disco. Now, we need a whole different conversation about what was happening to Iranian society in the years leading up to the revolution, and that's a whole different conversation. But basically, that the country has been taken over by a regime that says there's only one way of being, and I'm going to tell you what that way is. And
through the barrel of a gun. Yeah.
Yeah. My dad used to make fun of Stalin. He said, democracy, Stalin style. It's like, you have every right to speak your mind so long as it's what I tell you to speak. And it's exactly that. And, you and I are of the age that I feel like so much of our childhood had been spent through nostalgia, like all these years of like, 10 years ago it was this way, because I was born 1 year before the revolution. So some of my earliest childhood memories are like being on the street with my mom and being stuck in the middle of crossfire between Mujahideen Khalq and the Revolutionary Guards, or running into the basement because of the air raids.
Yeah.
And so much of this idea of like, oh, this is what it was like 5 years ago. This is what it was like 10 years ago. And so I grew up with this whole sense of everything I was seeing and I was hearing was about these things that had happened before I had come around. The episodes of Rangorang and whatever, which again, I don't know if that's necessarily a criteria of a better world or not, but it was different. It was obviously a very different world, feel, society, if you may.
It wasn't as monochromatic,
It wasn't.
Yeah.
Different people. Like there was more of a life, because I think what happened post-revolution, life went indoors. Things that could be expressed outside, joy, singing, dancing, things that people do. It all moved indoors.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't go away. It just went from something that you did it on a societal level, and it all became private. And I think that did many things to our psyche, our society, the way we behave, the things we hold dear, the position of women. It's like that's a much longer part of the conversation. But so I grew up through this whole sense of nostalgia. Both my parents had lost their jobs in the Cultural Revolution that happened 2 years after the 1979 revolution. My dad wanted to have his tie, and they basically told him, it's like, if you want to stay in the public sector, like you've got to do this and you've got to grow
put on
the
a
hair,
beard. Yeah.
And you can't do this. And my dad was stubborn. He's like, I'm not going to do it. So they fired him, and they fired my mom because my mom was married to my dad. And I was, I think, 3 at the time. So I've grown up during all of this stuff. And I think exactly as you said, we are in some form of exile. Now, to different extents, some people, if they go back, they're going to be arrested, it's like on site. Some people may not be necessarily arrested, but they're not going to have access to the same quality of life. Definitely as a queer person, you cannot be openly queer. So I think it comes down to, I sometimes talk to my mom and I say, I think we've gone through so many hardships that in our minds, unless you get killed, it doesn't seem to like register like that's a bad thing. I'm like, oh, you didn't die, so it wasn't so
It's all
bad.
good. Yeah.
It's like,
What are you
you're still
complaining
here.
about?
Yeah. And you think about it, and now that I'm getting older, and sometimes I want to ask my mom, I'm like, how did the quality of life change? Because my mom was 30 at the time of the revolution. And
So young. So young.
Yeah, it's like
Imagine. Yeah.
and I'm the baby. I'm like, my mom had my brother when she was 23 and me when she was 30. And she has this kind of like funny story about when the compulsory hijab comes in, is that I think she's going into a supermarket or something, and she has the hijab on and she's wearing a manto, and she goes to go in, and the guard is looking at her and saying like, "Madam, you can't go in." And my mom is like, "Why?" She's like, "Your toes." So she's wearing the hijab, she's wearing the manto, but she's wearing open-toe shoes with pedicured nails. And my mom is like,
Absurd.
The whole thing was so absurd that they said, put a hijab on your head. So the whole thing was just so foreign that it's like, I thought, okay, it's a thing on your head. It didn't also equate that, you also have to cover your feet or your legs.
Oh my God.
But historically, if you look at it, when Reza Shah came and forcibly
took it
the
off.
hijab
Yeah, take it off.
Then 50 years later, then they come and do the same thing just in the other direction.
Yeah.
And hopefully what we're learning is that maybe we should stop forcing people to do things.
We're
Now,
using women's bodies as a way to identify the state.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Because it's in Farsi we say divar kuta, the shortest wall. It's kind of like in that binary society that you basically, it's like you have the patriarch and then you have everybody else. Who is the easiest target? Women.
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of like sequester? How, it's like, how do you kind of like put it in the structure that you want? Because you obviously can start with men. You do it with women.
Yeah, I mean, Khomeini said when women change, society changes. Mm-hmm. And that became their project right away. And we both know this, yeah.
It's not that different from what Reza Shah is trying to do. So the thought process is the same. And Khomeini goes about doing the same thing, again, just in the opposite direction. Because, and one of the things my mom and I were talking about is like the idea of the Pahlavi dynasty is to modernize Iran. The mistake of it is we think that by modernizing the aesthetic of a culture, you're actually modernizing the culture, which now, 80 years post, we're realizing now, because, on the surface, people look more modern or more westernized or whatever. And the structures of modernity were there. Like, you have the building of a university and you have the building of a judiciary, and you have all of these aesthetic semblances of a modern society. But still, the superstitions were there. The patriarchy was there. The queerphobia was there. And, it's like we talked
to varying degrees, yeah.
To varying degrees, and depending on where you are in different places. But I also very plainly told my mom, I said, this dynasty had 50 years to change things. How do we expect to change?
Not a long time. Yeah.
It's not.
No.
It's not even a full generation. Now we're looking at it as like this thing of when Obama became president, they're like, we're in a post-racial society. And now 20 years later, they're like, we were not. Because we have this idea, oh, you do this change today and that changes everything. Like, no.
You had Trump right after. Yeah.
Yeah. You can change legislation, but changing the way people think, what they think, that takes a lot more than 50 years. But when the Woman Life Freedom protest started, and one of the things I actually told somebody, I said, this is not new.
Mm.
The world is taking notice now. But the cruelty, the murders, the executions, they started from day one of the revolution. So just we're clear on that. Acid being thrown in women's faces.
Cutting it.
It's like all the misogyny, all the cruelties against minorities and women. This didn't start 2 years ago. And I always want to tell people, this is when the pot boiled over. And the world took notice because of social media. But when I look at this younger generation, there's something they say that breaks my heart. But I also always say revolutions don't happen when people are unhappy. Revolutions happen when people are hungry. And maybe it's that they're not enough hungry people, because the revolution doesn't happen when the intellectuals decide that things should change. It's when the masses.
It's interesting you say that. I have a different perspective. I always think revolutions happen. When I look at sort of like 79, I always think that revolutions happened when people were really overstuffed and wanted more. So it's interesting you say that.
I feel that's where the revolution happens, in the upper crust.
Yeah.
In the intellectuals.
Yeah.
But the force behind it, you need the masses.
Mm-hmm. We just don't have that right now. Is that what you mean?
Don't.
Yeah.
Because like if you look at the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, the discontent had existed for decades before the actual revolution. But the actual revolution happens when an average person, a lower class person, doesn't actually have food to put on their table. Mm-hmm. Because that lower person doesn't perceive, and lower, I'm just saying like economically.
Yes.
Socioeconomically. That person, the things we talk about is, it's like freedom of speech and freedom of press. If you
Those
think
lofty
about it,
ideas.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's more of an intellectual concept. And a good portion of society doesn't particularly care about that because they're just very involved with the minutia of everyday life. Like, do I have money to pay my rent? Do I have money to send my kids to school? It's like the minutia, the everyday, if you think of it like trivialities of life. When they come out, when they're not getting paid, it wasn't just the intellectuals coming out onto the street in 79. I mean, they were there. But what destabilized the country were the big strikes, the national strikes at,
oil workers, the factories,
factory workers and all that, because that actually paralyzes a whole economy. Mm-hmm. And I think that may be one of the reasons why these movements in Iran and these, kind of like bursts of anxiety and desperation don't lead to bigger things. I think it's because also the regime is smart enough to realize where does their base lie and to make sure to keep that base happy enough, because if they lose that base, then they're gone. And they have the experience of knowing what actually paralyzed the previous regime in 78 and 79. Yes. So unfortunately, they already have a roadmap of how things can go really bad. And I feel that the younger generations in Iran, not that the regime has intended it to, they have more access to information. They're more educated. And they are more courageous in the way that they're like, you're going to kill me anyway, one way or another. So I'm going to die on my terms fighting you. Which is why I said that it's like, it breaks my heart, because these are my brothers and my sisters. These are, you know, my people, my countrymen, the people that are from the same city I was born in and I was raised in. And for them to get to that point that they're like, you're going to kill me anyway, so I'm going to fight. I feel that this is not something that's going to go away.
Do you think about going back? Do you think about ever going back?
I have nothing to go back to. You know, my dad passed away, my grandparents passed away, my mom is here. And to be absolutely honest with you, my years in Tehran are just filled with so much trauma. That if I ever went back, it would have to be, I don't know, something so monumental, so spectacular. Somebody once, you know, they knew how to get to my good side. And they're like, one day you'll come and perform at
Talerudaki or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, and of course to me, I mean, I've never even imagined such a thing. But even if I don't go back, I can be very honest about the reasons of that. I mean, my childhood in Iran was war. My teens in Iran was getting bullied and getting arrested and getting assaulted. And I left. And when I left, I feel like that Pouya kind of died so that this version of me could live. And I've made peace with that. Maybe it's almost like a resignation to the fact that I will always be an exile, because that culture and that country never made room for me. But they say never say never.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you for asking me. Oh my God, I'm being interviewed.
Oh, wait a second. Wait a second. I forgot to ask the two most important questions here. I left the sort of hard-hitting questions for the last bit here.
Yes, please.
Qeime or korma sabzi?
They're both home cooked.
Yes.
Korma sabzi.
Haide or mahasti?
Oh my God, this is unfair, Haide.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to speak with you.
Thank you, Aziza.
Thank you so much for tuning into the program. We hope you enjoyed this special Pride edition of Show and Tell and the amazing Pooya Mohseni. As always, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the episode and who else you want us to reach out to and for you to hear from. Listen, visit the Patreon. I really can't do this without all of your support. I want to let you know that Show and Tell is produced, written, and hosted by me, Samira Moyedin. The show is executive produced by the Iranian Diaspora Collective, and the creative producer of Show and Tell is Darlene Hune. Until next time, take care of one another. Talk soon.